So recently a study was released that was looking at the consumption of ultra-processed foods, but specifically plant-sourced ultra-processed foods, and the impact that these foods have on our hearts. Now, since the study has been published, there's been a couple of very interesting media articles that have manipulated what this study was showing to fit an agenda that they are constantly trying to push. In fact, the manipulation of this study is quite incredible. And the article I want to focus on today is an article that was published in the Telegraph, which was headlined, "Vegans are slowly killing themselves." Now, the article in question is by a journalist called Jamie Blackett. Now, if you've read Jamie's work before, then firstly, I am so incredibly sorry. But secondly, you'll already be fully aware that Jamie represents a dangerous combination of nauseating arrogance combined with incomprehensible ignorance. In fact, Jamie is so far behind the times, he's still worried about the corrupting influence of Elvis Presley's hips on the youth. Now, interestingly, the logic that Jamie uses actually makes a very compelling argument for veganism when applied to what the evidence is actually showing us. In fact, even when applied to what the evidence within the study that he's referencing is showing us, because Jamie has completely misrepresented the study that he's citing, either deliberately or through ignorance and a lack of scientific literacy. And of course, if he's manipulating us purposefully, that is incredibly disturbing. But if he's doing it through ignorance, well, that's incredibly disappointing and something that he should look at very intently. And actually, I have a resource that will help him. Because Jamie, and for people who are interested in learning about scientific literacy, one of the best places to start is looking at how to understand evidence and data. And today's sponsor can help us all with that. Now, today's sponsor is Brilliant, which is an interactive, fun, and engaging learning platform with thousands of lessons covering a wide variety of different subjects, including things like mathematics, technology, science, AI, and of course, understanding things like statistical analysis and data. And the lessons themselves have been created by award-winning academics and researchers from places like MIT and Caltech. Now, the way that Brilliant's lessons are structured mean that as well as learning what the lesson is teaching you, you're also learning transferable skills like problem solving and critical thinking at the same time. So if Brilliant sounds good to you, well, you can actually get started on Brilliant for free for 30 days by going to brilliant.org/EarthlingEd or by clicking the link in my description, where you'll also be able to get 20% off a premium annual subscription as well. So a huge thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. And now let's get back to the Telegraph article and find out if it is true that vegans are slowly killing themselves. So to get started, I'd actually like to reference one of Jamie's tweets. It's the tweet that he put out when he was sharing this article that he'd published in the Telegraph. Are any of the party's manifestos tackling the need to take pressure off the NHS by improving diets? They could start by taking ultra-processed vegan food off the menu. I mean, doesn't this just so succinctly prove how detached Jamie is from the data and evidence that exists? I just have this idea that Jamie is sat at home thinking about the NHS. Oh, how are we going to help the NHS? And he has this idea that in the NHS, there are just these skyrocketing numbers of people being taken into hospital because they've eaten vegan chicken nuggets. I mean, the problem is people like Jamie want to have their cake and eat it. On the one hand, they portray the narrative that plant-based burger sales are in decline. It's spiraling. People are giving up on veganism. No one's vegan anymore. No one's buying these products. Oh, the whole fad is over. So on the one hand, no one's eating plant-based alternatives, according to publications like the Telegraph. But on the other side, oh, these plant-based alternatives are posing a real risk to our healthcare system, and we better ban them because of the crisis the NHS is in and the burden these foods that apparently nobody is consuming is having on our healthcare system. But what's actually quite interesting is there has been a piece of research looking at what a plant-based diet would do to the NHS, and what this piece of research showed is that if everyone in England went on a wholly plant-based diet, it could save the NHS up to £6.7 billion a year, precisely because it would reduce the rates of chronic disease. So in other words, veganism and a plant-based diet, it's not a burden to the NHS, and it certainly wouldn't be a burden if it was adopted by more people. Actually, it would be the opposite. But then bear in mind that Jamie is a farmer. He farms cows for dairy, and he also produces crops that are used for alcohol. So let me just get this right. The way we should protect the NHS is by, banning plant-based alternatives. It's not by tackling things like cow's milk and dairy products, which are high in saturated fat, or indeed the processed and red meat that comes from the slaughtered cows once he's finished with them that are carcinogenic. No, it's not these things, and it's not the alcohol that he's responsible for producing, which is also a carcinogen and also increases the rates of disease. No, it's not the processed red meat, dairy, and alcohol that's causing the NHS problems. It's plant-based alternatives and veganism. Now, basically what I've just discussed is the crux of Jamie's article. So what I want to do now is just read you some passages from the article that he published. And then what I want to do is I want to bring in the study and talk to you about the study, what it actually looked like, what it actually analyzed, and what it actually revealed. Because I think by giving you the context of what Jamie's writing about and what his view is, it really starts to sink in just how manipulative he's been when we juxtapose what he said versus what the study is actually showing. Okay, so I want to start by reading the first paragraph of the article. Ultra highly processed vegan food can increase the risk of heart failure, according to research published in The Lancet. Surprise, surprise. Veganism is not healthy. It is time the government and its health agencies stood up to big food and celebrity proponents of veganism and finally called out the diet for the damage it is doing. Now, straight away, it's obvious that Jamie has been very deceptive. He's made the statement that veganism is not healthy. But of course, veganism isn't just about consuming different types of processed foods. So even if it was the case that this study revealed that the consumption of plant-based burgers increased the risk of heart disease and heart failure, that does not prove that veganism is unhealthy. So straight away, he's made a very manipulative statement that is based on a logical leap that is not shown by the evidence. And remember, I said, even if the study showed that. But now, I just want to read out the second paragraph as well. Thanks to the NHS, all taxpayers are stakeholders in the wider health of our nation. This involvement should make us less tolerant of any section of society creating a healthcare burden through any promotion of ignorance. Can you believe that that is what he has written? The audacity to make such a statement, such a contradictory and hypocritical statement, to be less tolerant of any section of society. Now, what's really hypocritical about all this is the ignorance of Jamie himself. Studies show us time and time again that the consumption of a whole food plant-based diet reduces the risk of many different chronic diseases. Who is promoting ignorance here? The man who makes money from producing dairy products, from selling cows for their flesh, red meat, carcinogens, and alcohol? Who's really promoting ignorance here around the NHS and around health and around certain sections of society creating a healthcare burden? And so then we jump to the end of the article. Jamie says, I don't subscribe to the NHS in crisis narrative. I mean, firstly, I'm not sure why I would care what Jamie thinks about the NHS in crisis narrative when there are, of course, doctors and nurses and people involved in the NHS who are very clear that the NHS is in crisis, but nonetheless, he goes on to say, but improved diets and the subsequent reduction in the rate of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease across the general population would better help the nation's health and pockets than blowing billions of pounds of taxpayer money on increasing capacity. Now, I totally agree with you, Jamie. Wouldn't it be great if we could relieve the NHS and also help people by giving them a very simple solution that would help in the treatment and prevention of chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, and would help them with things like weight management and weight control. Now, if only there was a diet that had been shown time and time again through nutrition science and scientific evidence to help with these things. If only there was one solution from a dietary perspective that would help us with this. Oh, there is. A whole foods plant-based diet. Jamie is literally advocating for a whole foods plant-based diet. That piece of research I cited earlier, the £6.7 billion per year saving to the NHS, the majority of that saving came from the reduction of things like diabetes. The study itself cited chronic diseases like diabetes, saying that a whole foods, wholly plant-based diet would help us in the prevention and treatment of these diseases. Jamie is advocating for a plant-based diet, but what he's doing is he's allowing his ideological dogmatism to shroud its objectivity and shroud any sense of clarity. And instead he is writing these nonsensical and absurd pieces which are obfuscating the truth, which are spreading doubt and misinformation and disinformation and distracting us from the fact that we actually do have a diet which can help with these issues, and that diet is a whole foods plant-based diet. And the thing is, it's not just that one study that I've cited that looks at this. We have so much information and so much scientific literature looking at the health benefits of whole plant food consumption. And so, for example, we have meta-analyses. Now, a meta-analysis is a study of studies. What the scientists do is they basically pull together all of the available research in the area that they're studying. So they get all of this research together and they comb through all of these different studies, and then they find what the balance of evidence is showing us. And we have these huge meta-analyses looking at millions of people that show that the consumption of foods like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, a whole foods plant-based diet is associated with a reduced risk in the most prevalent chronic diseases, including things like heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And not only that, but we have meta-analyses of clinical human trials which are considered the gold standard in nutrition research, which show that the consumption of whole foods over animal-based foods reduces things like LDL cholesterol and ApoB and inflammatory markers, and is helpful with controlling glycemic markers. In other words, we have these huge population studies showing a plant-based diet is good for us, and we also have these clinical trials, meta-analyses of clinical trials, which show that the consumption of whole foods is beneficial for us over the consumption of animal-based foods. When we look at the totality of evidence that exists, it is overwhelming. All we have to do is look at the balance of evidence, look at what the objective, credible scientific literature is showing us, and we can very clearly see that the consumption of whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds is good for us and far outweighs any supposed health benefits from animal products. We know what a healthy diet looks like. And when you look at the balance of evidence and you look at it clearly and objectively, it very much reveals to us how absurd, how illogical, and how ideologically dogmatic people like Jamie and these other journalists that write similar articles really are. So now let's look at the study in question. This is the study that Jamie is referencing to prove that veganism is now classified categorically as being unhealthy. Let's take a look at the study and then let's juxtapose what the study says with what Jamie says. So this study, as I've already mentioned, was looking at the consumption of ultra-processed food, particularly what they called plant origin ultra-processed food. Now, straight away, there's something important to bear in mind, which is that, as the authors of the study themselves said, plant-sourced foods are classified as being exclusively or primarily of plant origin. So what that means straight away is that some of the foods included within this category are not vegan and won't be being consumed by vegans. And so now what I'd like to do is read out to you a list of the ultra-processed plant-sourced foods that were covered in this study. Industrialized packaged breads, pastries, buns, and cakes, biscuits, margarine, industrial chips, French fries, confectionery, breakfast cereals, packaged salty snacks, industrial pizza, packaged prepared meals, distilled alcoholic drink, sauces, dressings, and gravies, and at the bottom, meat alternatives. Now, as you can see from this table, meat alternatives only accounted for 0.2% of the calories consumed by participants, and also the study doesn't even distinguish the risks associated with specific plant-sourced ultra-processed food. In other words, how can you possibly come to the conclusion that it's the plant-based alternatives that are responsible for increasing the risk of heart failure or heart conditions? The plant-based alternatives made up 0.2% of the calories, and they're being tied in with foods like cakes and French fries and confectionery and pre-packaged ready meals and alcohol. How can you possibly come to the conclusion that it's the plant-based alternatives which are increasing the risk when they're tied in with all of these other foods which are also being consumed at much larger quantities by the participants in the study? Clearly, if you come to the conclusion that it's the plant-based alternatives that should be condemned from the study, then clearly you've either not read the study properly or you're misrepresenting the study itself. And it's not just me that's saying this either. In relation to plant-based alternatives, the lead author of the study even stated, "We cannot draw specific conclusions related to this particular type of food." In other words, the plant-based alternatives. So let me just get this straight. The lead author of the study can't make conclusions on specific food items, but the Daily Mail can, and the Telegraph can, And worse than that, farmers for the Telegraph can. Where is the integrity? Where is the sincerity? Where is the accountability for journalists and for writers of opinion pieces and news stories when they so clearly manipulate evidence? How is this right? How is this allowed? We now have a farmer who is anti-scientific, who is clearly ideologically biased, misrepresenting a piece of information, having that published in the Telegraph, and people will read this, and they will now think to themselves, veganism is unhealthy, plant-based alternatives are going to cause heart disease. They should be banned to protect the NHS. This is the conclusion that people are coming to because of a deliberate, potentially, or at least ignorant misrepresentation of a study. A farmer misrepresenting a study and coming to a conclusion that the lead author of the study says that you can't come to. But here's where it gets even better, because the study actually looked at unprocessed plant foods as well. In other words, whole plant foods. And what they found is that when you compare whole plant foods to processed plant origin foods, unprocessed animal source foods, and processed animal sourced foods, so all the different foods we can consume, it was the unprocessed plant foods which were the best for our heart, which decreased the risk of heart failure and heart disease, cardiovascular problems. It was actually the whole plant foods which were the best for our heart. So again, I ask the question, is this deliberate or just ignorant? Is Jamie citing this piece of research because he knows that his readers are not going to look into it and he can just run with that? Or did he not read it? Was he sent a press release, or did he see it shared somewhere and he didn't read the study and he just put his version of what he wanted the study to say into an article? Because either it's deliberate or it's purely ignorant. Either way, it's incredibly dangerous what he's done. I just think it's important to mention at the end very quickly that, like I said, the study itself doesn't prove anything about plant-based alternatives. And so it doesn't prove that they're bad for our heart. It doesn't even prove that they're bad for us necessarily. Firstly, I think grouping all plant-based alternatives together is actually unhelpful, because not all alternatives are the same. Some are healthier than others, so we shouldn't group them all together necessarily anyway. But then grouping plant-based alternatives in with this wider category, which includes things like alcohol and biscuits and cakes and all the things I listed earlier, is incredibly unhelpful. Now, I'm not saying that these foods are necessarily the healthiest for us, or that they necessarily promote positive health outcomes. But what I am saying is that the media representation of them is unsubstantiated and isn't supported, especially by this piece of scientific literature. And so we shouldn't view plant-based alternatives as being, the most unhealthy and toxic foods that you can consume, even if that's often the way they're represented. Yes, let's eat a whole foods plant-based diet, but also let's not unfairly demonize plant-based alternatives. So I just want to end by reading out, again, a couple of passages from Jamie's article. Thanks to the NHS, all taxpayers are stakeholders in the wider health of our nation. This involvement should make us less tolerant of any section of society creating a health care burden through any promotion of ignorance. Improved diets and the subsequent reduction in the rate of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease across the general population would better help the nation's health and pockets than blowing billions of pounds of taxpayer money on increasing capacity. Well, Jamie, I couldn't have put it any better myself. Now, if you've enjoyed listening to me dissect this argument and go into the evidence and debunk the narrative that Jamie and the Telegraph are trying to push, well then my book, How to Argue with the Meat Eater and Win Every Time, might be the right book for you. Because within that book, I go through all of the arguments against veganism and debunk them one by one. And I also look at how media manipulates certain pieces of research to create narratives to fuel their agendas. I look at all of this and so much more. So if that does sound interesting to you, you can grab a copy of How to Argue with the Meat Eater and Win Every Time by going to one of the links in my description. All right. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. A huge thank you to Brilliant as well for sponsoring today's video. And I very much look forward to seeing all of you in the next video.